So today we are still having problems with that. We're talking about Japanese gardens. Japanese gardens are considered a high art form in Japan. The design of these gardens, I don't know if you've ever been in a Japanese garden and see them being maintained. We were in one the other day, and by the way, if you ever go back to Fukuoka, I think a few of you found it. There's a Japanese garden in Ohori Park that is spectacular, and there were 2 other people in the garden, and it was a fairly large garden. But we noticed that one of the gardeners was down on his hands and knees clipping the grass with hand clippers. This is the kind of care they take. Japanese gardens, everything in them is intentional, even though it will not look like it to you. This is a garden that was begun early in the 14th century. It's called the Moss Garden in Kyoto. The name of it is Saihoji. And all of this was very intentionally done. There is nothing that is there by accident in a Japanese garden. The goal of a Japanese garden is to not have any artificial ornamentation, but entirely highlight the natural landscape. The purpose is to use plants, stone, particularly worn stone, worn materials, to suggest an ancient and faraway natural landscape, to imply the passage of time, and even the fragility of existence. The reason why when you go to a Japanese garden you get this sense of, of just tranquility and peace is because that has been very carefully nurtured by the designers and the maintainers of Japanese gardens to give you a sense of an almost otherworldly kind of place. The earliest Japanese gardens were created, the ideas, like so many things, were brought over from Japan in the Asuka period, which was 538 to 710 AD. And the first gardens came to Honshu, the largest of the Japanese islands, and on Honshu they began to create these gardens, but they invested them with particularly Japanese kind of features, particularly from the island of Honshu. They would create artificial mountains and cascading water, pebble beaches that are suggested, and Japanese gardens are built on a couple of major principles. One of them is reduction of scale, so that you see a garden, even just a corner garden in a house. How many of you went to Chiron, to the samurai houses and gardens? Were you not impressed with how just in the little corner of a courtyard of a house they could create something that made you feel like you were experiencing the great outdoors? Well, that idea of reduction of size and yet giving you a sense of a much greater scale is one of the techniques that they use. Another is symbols. Everything in a Japanese garden, almost everything, symbolizes something else. The raked sand may represent the sea. A stone pathway may be designed to look like a river or a cascading stream if there's no water actually available, although there is water in almost all Japanese gardens, of any size at least, if there's room for it. So the earliest Japanese gardens were designed as specifically meditation gardens for the emperor and for shoguns and for major nobility. And they're heavily influenced by religious connotations, and particularly Taoist and Shinto. In Taoism, there's a major legend about the 8 immortals who lived on 5 islands, and each of the islands was on the back of a turtle. And the 8 immortals flew from their 5 islands on cranes. And so when you go to gardens, and if you went to the garden in Hiroshima, the islands that they had there, they had 8 islands. They all were made to look like either turtles or cranes. The islands, some of them had flat rocks coming out from the sides of them to represent cranes. And so this symbolism you'll find everywhere in gardens. Stones are put out to represent turtles, since the turtle is considered the foundation for which all of those islands were. Shinto also has had an influence on it. There are stories about 8 islands in Shinto, and so sometimes you'll see 5, which is the Taoist effect, sometimes you'll find 8 or other numbers, but always there's this sense that islands are very important, and they're represented by rocks and stony islands, sometimes with trees on them. Particularly, you'll find beautiful gardens around Buddhist temples, around Shinto shrines. And somebody was asking me, and I'll give you a few ideas at the end of this, but where in Kyoto you could go to see nice gardens, and I said, walk down the street. Every 10 or 15 minutes you will see either a torii gate, which is an entrance to a a Shinto shrine or you will see a Buddhist temple. And every one of them will have some sort of created garden in them. And so you can stumble across gardens all over Kyoto. Many of the things that we would assume are naturally occurring, well, let me do this first. This is not a Japanese garden. This is a garden in Western Europe, and this illustrates the difference between the approach to gardening in Europe and the approach to gardening in Japan. The Japanese their aesthetic is that everything should have a natural appearance, that it should appear as though it's been there for a very long time and has just, the moss has grown on the stones have been worn down, whereas there's no trimming of things in sharp angles. In fact, there are no diagonals or sharp angles anywhere in Japanese gardens. This actually was created. That's not a natural little waterfall. Water is very important in Japanese gardens. They will often have a pond or if possible two ponds that are connected by a channel or stream. They'll often have waterfalls. The sound of the cascading water is part of what they're looking for here. There are a number of different kinds of gardens, three in particular. There are hill gardens called Tsukiyama. There are dry gardens, sometimes called Zen Gardens, and I'll talk about that in a bit. Karen Sansui, they're called, and then tea gardens, Chaniwa. The tea gardens are ones that are built around tea houses and where the tea ceremony would be practiced, and they are places of meditation because the tea ceremony is considered an act of meditation as well. So Japanese gardens really try to focus on a spiritual connection with the land, and also the Shinto influence, a connection to the kami, or the spirits or deities of the land. Waterfalls, particularly large waterfalls, but also large stones, old trees, all are considered to have kami, and they may be incorporated as major features in Japanese gardens because they believe there's a spiritual aspect, and that gardens are often the places, especially in Shinto shrines, where one has access to the kami, the spirits. This is part of the belief that they're built on. A huge part of this is selecting the right materials. Selecting the right stones, the right plants, is the most important part of creating a garden like this. And it is, as I said, considered a high art. There is a principle that they use in Japanese gardening, which is called koan ni shitagao, which literally means obeying the request of an object. You may have heard some of your guides in the gardens talk about the fact that the masters of gardening will actually listen to the stone or a plant, a tree, to find out where it ought to be placed in relationship to others, because they believe that there is a perfect, an ideal location for each element, and sometimes they'll look like they're random, that the rocks are just placed randomly, either in a grassy area or particularly in a Zen garden where they're surrounded by stones, gravel that is, but there is a specific intentionality, and the master gardeners will believe that there is one correct or ideal place for the placement of each of these things, and they will seek that. There are a number of different kinds of miniaturized landscapes. I mentioned that reduction of scale is one of the critical things. There are gardens that are designed in an ocean style that will have a pond, and you will notice somewhere on that pond there will be usually a pebble beach. I noticed that there was rounded stones were laid to create sort of a beach effect at in Hiroshima at the garden that we went to. There's also a broad river style where if you have flowing water, you will create a meandering kind of river and the various plantings around that. There is a marsh pond style, which will usually feature lotus flowers and various other kinds, lily pads, that sort of thing. There is a mountain torrent style, which is what this would represent, where you have sufficient waterfalls to get a sense that there is a mountain that is feeding this, even though it would be a very small waterfall. You don't usually get large waterfalls in Japanese gardens. And then there's what's called a rose letter style, which would generally use flowers of various kinds and be more like a meandering garden. Now, I've been asked the question before, why is it that you don't see a lot of flower beds or flowers? You do see some flowering plants. In fact, in some gardens intentionally plant flowers that will bloom at different times of the year. That is, the bushes will bloom. But they don't usually emphasize flowers. They will usually emphasize evergreens, because many of these gardens came during the time of the shoguns and the samurai. Again, the chiran houses that we saw were samurai houses. And flowers were seen as a symbol of impermanence, you know, of short life, because flowers don't last very long. Whereas evergreens are seen as long life or even eternal life. And so especially for the shoguns and the samurai, who were warriors, who always were confronted with the possibility of dying in battle, they much preferred gardens that represented long life or eternal life, that is evergreen, rather than flowers. Although you will get flowering bushes, azaleas and camellias and other kinds of flowering plants. Most Japanese gardens are designed according to a Buddhist geomancy, it's called. It's similar to the Taoist idea of feng shui, that everything has appropriate place, and that's part of that asking an object, you know, where it should be. For instance, in that principle, all water should always flow from the east or the southeast to the west, because in doing so, it brings good luck. If it goes from the west to the east, it's considered, according to Buddhist geomancy, as being to wash away your good luck. And so that's considered a bad idea. So you get the idea. There are a lot of principles that are behind all of this. This is an example of a Zen garden, the Blissful Mountain Garden at Daitokuji. You'll notice that there are different height stones. Generally, stones will be collected in numbers. 1, 2, 3, 5, 7, 3 being the most popular. And generally, when you have a garden that has 3 stones, they will be of 3 different heights. Not always, but often they are intended to represent the lowest stone. The flattest stone will represent the earth. The highest stone will represent the heavens. And the one in between represents humanity, which is between the heavens and the earth. And so there's very specific symbolism. From time to time, you will have one rock that will stick out that represents the jumping of carp. Carp are very important in the Japanese symbology. That's why you see carp as the fish. By the way, don't ever try to eat a carp. The reason that you have all these huge fat carp and they live for, you know, is because they're virtually inedible. When I lived in the South, we had carp in a lake where I lived, and they said the only way to eat a carp, there's one recipe. You take the carp, you slather it with mud, you nail it to a board, bake it in a 500-degree oven for 12 hours, you take it out, throw away the carp, and eat the board. Don't ever try to eat a carp, okay? So these big fat fish, don't try to catch them. They're full of bones, they taste awful, all right? Just a little side note. So all of these different stone arrangements represent symbols. You will notice that the gravel here, and this is a dry garden or Zen garden, the gravel is raked, in this case, to represent waves. Often, if there is no actual water involved in a garden, like a dry garden landscape, the Zen gardens, they will carefully rake either to create clean geometries, and they will do that as an act of meditation, but also to create symbols. This represents the waves of the ocean, in terms of the white gravel being a representation of the water of the ocean, and you'll find that kind of symbolism a lot. Rock and water are seen as yin and yang to one another, and so rock and water, or rock and something that symbolizes water, like white gravel, will often be used together. As I mentioned, there's sometimes what appear to be randomly placed stones. Well, there's a principle called tsutaishi. Tsutaishi means nameless or discarded, but it's still done very intentionally. It's done very much on purpose. There is no accident here. It's not like, oh, I'll throw this rock over my shoulder and see where it lands and we'll leave it there. No, they're very careful about how they do this placing. Now, there is a difference in Japanese gardens and Chinese gardens, and I'll get into the detail of that in a minute, but the Chinese gardens tend to be much more, the buildings are fancier. The buildings tend to be either right on or over the water. Japanese gardens, the buildings are back away from the water, and they are not emphasized. Frequently, they're almost covered by trees. They have much simpler design. So there are very specific differences between the Japanese and the Chinese. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. Bridges are also very important. They have a great deal of symbolism. Bridges may be made from stone or wood or earth-covered logs that have moss over them. They can be either arched or flat, and frequently you will find that there will be two bridges that have an island or a peninsula in the middle, so that you go from one area to an island and then from that island to the next area. In certain kinds of gardens, like a Pure Land Buddhist garden, I talked to you about Amida, the Buddha, that would take, it's also called Western Paradise Buddhism. The idea that if you have faith in and recite the mantra for the name of Amida Buddha, then Amida Buddha will take you to paradise. Well, in a Pure Land Buddhist garden, that center island represents Amida. That you cross to Amida, and Amida will take you the rest of the way. In some cases, in other kinds of Buddhist or Shinto gardens, it may represent the past, the present, and the future, or other kind of symbolism, but they're very intentional about that kind of emphasis. Sometimes as well, bridges may represent Mount Horai, which is the ultimate eventual home of the 8 immortals of Taoist mythology. This is an example of a Pure Land garden where you have just a tiny little center piece. You've got an arch, and then the center stone that was intentionally put there, and then another bridge beyond that. So the idea is you cross to Amida in faith, and Amida will take you on to paradise. The Pure Land or Amida Buddhism is the most faith-oriented of all the Buddhist sects, where it is faith in the Amida that will save you. Another important feature, and this started out in just Buddhist gardens, but later on was adopted by Shinto shrines as well. And by the way, if they ever say, a guide ever says temple, that means Buddhist. If they say shrine, that means Shinto. And of course you have a lot of both Shinto and Buddhism. The principle, yesterday we were on the tour and the guide was talking about the symbolism that at Hiroshima they had a figure that was partly represented Christianity because it was like an angel with wings. It partly represented Buddhism, partly represented Shinto. And she said that's very consistent. And I said, yeah, Shinbutsu Shugo, which is the principle of the interweaving or the syncretizing of the different religions. She went, yes, 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 you understand. Because that's very much part of what they are. So principles that originally, or items that originally used to be part of one, like Buddhist temples, have now become common in Shinto shrines as well. And this is one of them. This stone lantern is called a daidoro. Daidoro are, there actually is a very significant meaning to them in Buddhist cosmology. There are 5 different parts to these lamps. The part that touches the ground is to represent the chi, or the earth. The next section up is represents the water, or sui. The middle part, where the flame would be, if there was a candle in here, would be it represents fire, or ka. The 4th level, which is the flat top part, would represent the sky or air, the fu, and the very top represents the spirit, or the ku. So each of these sections of these daidoro, or stone lanterns, represents some aspect of Buddhist cosmology and have significance. You'll also, when you come into sometimes Buddhist temples, but always pretty much the Shinto shrines, before you cross through the torii. Torii are the big double-top gates that are in front of Shinto shrines, which separate the secular space on the outside from the sacred space inside. You've all been to my talks and you've heard about the torii. Well, outside the torii, there will usually be a tsukubai. A tsukubai is a stone basin, and they will have bamboo ladles there. And you are to use the tsukubai to wash your left hand and then wash your right hand and then rinse out your mouth as a way of symbolically purifying yourself before you enter the sacred territory. But these tsukubai, these stone basins, are very, very common in both Shinto shrines, in Buddhist temples, and many of the gardens will have them as well. Sometimes there's simply a stone that has had a hollowed out place in the center, either naturally or that they've created, and they will have a bamboo spout that will come out and drip water or slowly stream water. And part of that, again, is that not only that there is a water source there, but the sound of the water contributes to the whole aesthetic of the Japanese garden. Nothing in a Japanese garden is left to chance. All the plantings are very intentional. Everything is chosen according to a desire to either hide unpleasant things, things that they don't want to be visible, or to as a background to certain kinds of features they want to emphasize in the front of it, or to create in itself a picturesque scene. A couple of our guides have talked about an important principle too, and that is borrowed scenery. Borrowed scenery means that when a master gardener designs a garden, he will consider what is beyond the parameter of that garden. If there is a mountain or a forest, if there are tall trees, that will be seen as something that can be incorporated into the visual impact of the garden. That's called borrowed scenery. I commented to Carolyn when we were in the Hiroshima garden that on one side there are all of these apartment buildings that you could see, and I said that's not the best kind of borrowed scenery because usually it's something natural and it almost appears as though it's blending into the look of the overall scenery. But consideration is given to color, to shape, to the way that trees and bushes are trimmed, all of it, and frequently the trees are picked for symbolism. The lotus flower, if you've got a marshland type garden, the lotus is considered a sacred symbol of purity, because while the roots of the lotus are in the mud at the bottom of the pond, the lotus flower itself is pure white and represents purity coming out of impurity. And so that's why the lotus is always seen as a sacred flower, particularly in Buddhism. The most common kinds of trees that they have in gardens, and you've seen these as we went along, azalea trees, camellia trees, oak, Japanese apricot, cherry trees, Japanese maples, willow trees, ginkgo, Japanese cypress, Japanese cedar, pine, and bamboo. Those are by far the predominant kinds of plants that they will have. And of course, with Japanese maple, you get these brilliant, either golden or flame color. The fall in the gardens that have maples and other kinds of hardwood trees like that can be very, very beautiful. And of course, there are koi. Koi are literally nishiki goi, as they're called in Japanese, are brocaded carp. They are a kind of carp. Now, these colored carp, the nishiki goi, brocade carp, were only domesticated and interbred to create those brilliant colors in the 1820s. So it's only, less than 200 years ago that they really developed this. But back more than 1,000 years ago, under the Song Dynasty, they had developed goldfish from Prussian carp. And so they had large goldfish, and goldfish were used for a long time in the Chinese, and still today in many of the Chinese gardens. But these carp can be yellow, orange, white, red and white, black, red and white, blue, extraordinary colors. And the Japanese their fascination with these brocaded carp, koi, they have a different name for every possible color combination. And they consider them almost different breeds, and they are very careful about breeding certain colors together in order to create those designs. Now you'll see most of the carp you'll see in a pond, they'll all be together, but if they left them alone, then in just relatively few generations they would begin to go back to their very dull kind of color. So the bright colors, they have to necessarily maintain a program of breeding the right kind of fish. Some koi have been proven to be in excess of 200 years old. There was one koi that had been passed on from family member to family member, from generation to generation, and even between families. And when it finally died, they had it examined because they knew it was old. And apparently, I didn't know this, I'm not an ichthyologist, but the fish scales have developed rings like a tree. And by counting those, you can determine how old it is. And they determined that this one fish who had a particular name, you live that long and they give you a name, and I don't remember what it was right now, but that he was 227 years old when he died. A fingerling, a small carp, koi, you can probably buy for 10 bucks. A really nice adult specimen could cost you 300 bucks. A prize koi, a really extraordinary colored one that is large and healthy, could cost $20,000.
Oh, wow.
So they're very serious about this, as you can well tell, and they're extraordinarily beautiful. I would love to have a koi pond, but I don't think our Malinois would let that last very long, our dogs. This garden is a good example where, and it's sort of cut off at the top, there is a mountain in the background. It's Higashiyama. Higashiyama in the background is considered borrowed scenery here because it really fills in the whole look of this. This is a meandering stream kind of garden with various kinds of plantings. Again, you don't see any color except green, but you do have the sound of the water. This represents a lot of those kinds of aesthetic principles. Now, there are differences in the kinds of gardens. A Zen garden, or a dry landscape garden, is intended to be viewed all at once and from the outside. When you have a beautiful garden with, raked stone, they're not inviting you to traipse through that. Okay, you don't walk through one of those gardens, in case you were tempted. It's intended to be, it's a Zen meditation garden because you sit outside it and you look at it and meditate on the meaning of the various stones, the various other kind of symbols that are represented in it. But there are then promenade gardens, or gardens that are intended, like this one would be, for you to wander through and to follow the paths through. And ideally they are designed so that at each turn, or as you walk through it, you are regularly exposed to different views, different vistas. Carolyn and I were taking pictures. We've been to a couple of brilliant gardens in the last few days, and we're taking pictures, and it's like, how many thousand pictures to try to catch how beautiful all the different views are as you wander through these gardens, up small hills and down hills and around corners and around ponds and that sort of thing. There is, as I said, never diagonals that are evident. There's never square angles. There's no one feature that dominates in the Japanese garden. In Chinese gardens, they sometimes will take one item, an extraordinary rock or tree, and really make that, practically shine a spotlight on it, that's the whole focal point. That's not the Japanese aesthetic. They will have these beautiful things, but they're intentionally sort of melded into the rest of the effect of the garden as you go through. But Japanese gardening is considered as high in art as painting or calligraphy. This is, I want to talk about the difference now between Chinese gardens and Japanese gardens. This is a garden we went to in Shanghai a month or so ago, Yuan Garden. It's right in downtown Shanghai. You wouldn't know it once you get in the garden. But this is represented by extraordinary buildings. You can see the detail in terms of the roof lines and stuff. The fact that there are outside areas that you overlook the water, and there are koi in this water. So a Chinese garden will always be walled off, which is why you wouldn't know that you were in the middle of Shanghai when you were in this garden. They will have one or two ponds, lots of rockworks, trees, and they'll have more flowers typically than a Japanese garden will. There will be an assortment of different halls or buildings. Those buildings will be on the water or even frequently over the water. The intention in a Chinese garden is that the view of the garden is intended to be enjoyed from inside those halls. So the vistas are to be seen from inside the buildings or from the the patios, in this case the area just outside the building. So the people who live in, own, whatever the building, they're the ones that are the focus of enjoying this. The buildings, there are bigger buildings. In fact, often in Chinese gardens, the buildings will take up more than half of the total space of the garden. And so they are really the focal point, very elaborate in their design. As I say, they will often take rocks that are very large, very unusual, particularly if the rock looks like an animal or something else, and they'll center it and feature it in terms of your experience. Japanese gardens, on the other hand, the buildings are very simple. They don't want the focus to be on the buildings, so they're not right on the water. They're back away from the water. They tend not to be nearly as fancy. The viewpoint is not intended to be from the buildings. The viewpoint is either, in the case of a Zen garden, from outside looking in, or that you wander through the gardens and your experience of the beauty of the garden happens while you're in the garden, as opposed to Chinese. The rocks will be smaller, more natural, arranged in more natural alignments in an integrated way, and they will focus more on miniaturization. Much more, rather than have buildings out over lakes, they will have a pond where they create the sense of this being like an ocean or a sea, which they don't do nearly as much in Chinese gardening. In terms of the design of Japanese gardens is very much like the perspective and the approach they take to Japanese painting. When I talked before about Japanese art and architecture, I said that the formal kind of Western perspective, which is usually represented in textbooks, like looking down a railroad track where it's wider closer to you and then it gets narrower as it gets away from you. That's how we define near and far. That's not, that Western approach to perspective is not what they use in Japan or China. What they will do is to create a sense of depth or perspective. They will have up close kinds of images which are represented by being darker and in clearer detail. There then will be a middle ground which is less dark and less clear, and then there will be far distant ground which will be very shady. This is how they represent perspective rather than this sort of railroad track line perspective. Now this same idea of near ground, middle ground, and far ground in terms of seeing things is exactly how they designed Japanese gardens. And they will even emphasize this idea, or actually they'll imitate the idea of distance by using similar plants that are smaller further away. So that if you have a podocarpus tree, you know, which the ones that look like they have the, you know, the manicured pom-pom sorts of things, if you have a large one close to you, and then a distance out there is one that's actually quite small, but it looks the same, you know, the principle of bonsai, the idea that you take small plants and make them look as though, in terms of proportion and whatnot, they look like large plants. They will intentionally do that so that it looks like that is further away because it's smaller. And in doing so, they can take a fairly small area and make it look much larger. This is also why they will create what looks like ocean beaches and things in miniature. And so this kind of perspective is very important in the designing of those gardens. This is one of the most popular sites in all of Japan. Can you tell me what it is? The Golden Pavilion. Good on y'all. I'm from the South after all. I had to throw in y'all every once in a while just to be interesting. This Golden Pavilion is not designed according to the Japanese style. Just let you know that up front. It is one of the most popular sites in all of Japan. If you go to Kyoto, you'll have an opportunity, if you go to the Golden Pavilion, to visit it with 50,000 of your closest friends, because it is huge crowds that go there. Everyone, when they go to Kyoto, want to go to the Golden Pavilion. And it is an extraordinary site. The upper two levels are layered in real gold leaf. So interestingly enough, the bottom floor is designed like a traditional Japanese house. The upper floors, and you'll notice that up here they've got much more of the upswept roof line, much fancier. That's very Chinese, and the fact that it's right on the water is very Chinese. This was intentional. They designed it more as a Chinese garden. But in addition to this building, it's a huge garden area, and there are beautiful corners and little, you know, there'll be a daidoro, a Japanese lantern, and beautiful plantings. There are places here, one of the nicest places I've ever seen, where they have what looks like there should be water running in it. It's a stone along one of the paths as you come back out of this area. And it's intended to be dry stone, but it looks like a small stream because it's the use of stone in place of the flow of water. But they do have a lot of water as well. So this is an extraordinary place, but if you're going to go to the Golden Pavilion, try to go early in the morning as soon as it opens, because if you don't, it is going to be crowded. Just be prepared for that. It's still worth doing, I think, but it's going to be crowded. Somebody asked me to give a list of some of the best gardens. I can't say what are the best gardens in Kyoto. Remember, there's 1,600 of them. But here are a few that you might want to consider if you go to Kyoto. The first three are Karansansui, or dry, or Zen gardens. The first one, Ryoanji, the Ryoanji Garden and Ryoanji Temple, was one of the places I think that National Geographic said is one of 24 places you must see before you die. It is a Zen garden, so it is dry stone. It's very unusual in that within the gravel area they have clusters of stones, some 5, some 3, some 2, and there are 15 total stones. The garden is designed so that you can't see all of the garden at once. You have to move around to different sides of it from the outside, but you cannot see all 15 stones at one time. There is no place that you can go that you can see all 15 stones. And according to the sort of theology behind it, 14 stones are the most you can see unless you have achieved enlightenment, in which case you will be able to see the 15th stone. So as a dry Zen garden, it's extraordinary. The Tofuku-ji Temple, the Kyunan-ji Temple, and then strolling gardens, the Golden Pavilion, which is technically the Kinkaku-ji gardens, The Genkakuji temple, which is the Silver Pavilion, Okochi Sanso Villa, the Sento Gosho, which is part of the Kyoto Imperial Palace Park. It's sort of separated from it, and you don't. And then the Shugakuin Rikyo Imperial Villa. Some of these are temples. Some of them were part of the villas. For instance, the Kinkakuji, the Golden Pavilion, originally was a residence for the one of the Akagashi shoguns. And then later on, when he died, his son turned it into a temple. So it's now referred to as a temple. It's either the Golden Pavilion or sometimes called the Golden Temple. I'm giving you these names. You know, find Wi-Fi somewhere, go online, and all you have to type in is Kyoto Gardens. They will give you lists of gardens. You can look at them, you know, photographs and things like that, make your own decisions. They'll give you maps as to where they are. If you're going to have a guide, any guide can tell you where the great gardens are. But like I say, some of these, by the way, the imperial ones and some others, you have to make reservations in advance. So if you go online and look, pay close attention to whether or not they are open for visits just randomly, or if you have to make reservations, there are a couple on this list and a few others that you actually have to be part of a guided tour. You cannot go into on your own even if you've made reservations. So just a warning, there's different rules for different gardens. But I would recommend that you check that out. But again, you get into Kyoto and walk down any of the main streets and you're going to come across gardens in the city.